Hello, I am Harvey Ambrose, and I am preaching this message on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. Recorded on YouTube due to technical difficulties at the station, but to be preached tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Liberia time. We are continuing our study of the book of Genesis. We are in chapter 20. And I plan to read the entire chapter. It's a long reading, but it seems the best way to proceed. So Genesis chapter 20, forgive errors in advance that I may make. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country, and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and journeyed in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, She is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said unto him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, She is my sister? And she, even she herself, said, He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. For I also withheld thee from sinning against her. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called his servants, and told all these things in their ears. And the men were sore afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet, indeed, she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, This is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, He is my brother. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants, and gave them unto Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes, unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech, and his wife, and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of all the house of Abimelech, because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And that's chapter 20, the mistakes I made of the book of Genesis. I don't have time to go through this verse by verse, nor do I know if it would be profitable to do so. But there are many lessons contained in this. I doubt that I can find them all, and nor would I comment fully on everything I find. But some things do seem to jump out at us. In the first place, Abraham journeyed away from where he had been in the plains of Mamre for about 20 years, and he went to the land of the Philistines, to a place called Gerar. And so a Philistine king by the name of Abimelech ruled in that area. And, the purpose why he left from where he was is not divulged. It could be that its proximity to the destroyed cities of the plains, where the smoke was rising up when, like a furnace after the destruction, as Abraham saw it. He just thought to remove himself far from the overthrow that God had effected against sinful men. It could be that being Lot's uncle, his reputation was also damaged by having a nephew that was involved in that overthrow by his complacency. There may be all kinds of reasons, but he got up and he moved. And he got up and he moved at a very bad time, one would think, because God had told him that Sarah would conceive and bear a child at this, according to the time of life in the following year, meaning essentially the human gestation period, approximately 9 months. She had not yet conceived, because in chapter 21 we read that she does. But one would think that after nearly 100 years of hoping for a child, and most of that time of a child by his wife Sarah, which had never happened, and God promising a miraculous birth, because it would be that, in any case, that he would not want to move his wife away from her home of 20 years at exactly such a precarious time. A 90-year-old woman about to conceive and give birth. He had some compelling reason. And we always do. The things that we do, sometimes they're for right, sometimes they're for wrong, sometimes they're careless. We think we have reasons for them, sometimes we do. Sometimes the reasons do not account for the consequences of the actions that we take. It would teach us to be sober and to think about things before we do them, and better than that, to pray about them. We don't know that Abraham prayed or that he didn't pray prior to this move. We know that he made it for some reason. He gets there and he repeats a sin, exactly repeats it, that he had committed when he went down to Egypt for food. Now, he had a reason to go to Egypt. There was a famine in the land when he got to the land of Canaan. And for the sake of life, and his life and the life of those with him, he had to have food. So he went down to Egypt and he made this lie. Now, he justifies it. Says, well, she is my sister. She's my father's daughter, but she's, she's the daughter of a woman who is not my mother. So, like a second wife of his father. So they were half brother and sister. And you might think that's only half a lie. Well, it might be a half truth, in so much that she was indeed his half sister. He didn't specify sister, full sister, half sister, quarter sister, who knows? He didn't specify that. You may think he didn't lie, but the purpose of saying it is so that he would not die and that his wife could be taken rather than his own life taken. His wife would be taken by another man in the event that the men were minded to kill him because they wanted his wife. Now, she surely was his wife, and the salient point of this whole exercise of fear about his wife being taken from him and him slain so that she could be had was because she was his wife. Had nothing to do with her being a half-sister or anything else. So basically, she says she's my sister because he's afraid of dying. And because he doesn't trust God to provide. Before he went off into these lies, he should have sought God, and God could have given him all the assurances that he needed, that God understood the situation and would take care of him without him having to sin. But no sooner had he received this blessing, this promise, and he believed the promise that he'd be the father of many nations, that it would be through a child of his wife Sarah, as opposed to a Egyptian slave woman, that this blessing would come. It would be a blessing to all nations. He believed all that. It says he did not, I'm trying to think of the word, but he totally believed the promise of God. We read in the book of Hebrews. But somehow we are able to believe the big things that God promises us. If we become his people, if we are born again into the family of God, we are removed from the families and the kingdoms of this world spiritually, which is really what matters, only left in them physically, which matters far less because the body's got to die anyway. If we've been born again into God's kingdom, promises apply to us of resurrection, eternal life in a new world, and glorious things accruing to us forever. And we believe them, and we ought to believe them because God cannot lie. But somehow we rationalize and we think, well, he's made these big promises about the end results of life, but he hasn't really, told me what's going to happen tomorrow, or what's going to happen next month, what's going to happen if this person wants to do that to me or to my wife. Will he spare my life and yet still raise up a child to me, and I won't be around to see it? See, we have what we think are legitimate questions, and they are questions that aren't answered in Scripture, nor, since there were no Scriptures at that time, by direct revelation of God to Abraham. And yet the very fear of it, of such unanswered questions that occur to our minds, the very fear of it has a root in there, and the root is that we don't trust God to both know what's going on in our lives and to take a hand to bring to pass that which is best for us. Of those of us who are saved, the New Testament teaches us that all things work together for good to them that love God and are the called according to his purpose, meaning the saved. We may not see how all things are going to work together for good. Bad things happen to the people of God in this world. They happen to people that are outside the family of God. They happen to all men because sin is in the world. And there's trouble in a world that's been cursed by God amongst men who are enemies of God. There's trouble on every hand at times. But for someone who has been saved by God, like Abraham had been, and favored by God, like Abraham had been, like every one of you is saved, and I mean truly saved by God, has been blessed above all the people of the earth, with not only some blessings here, but certain sure blessings eternally, blessings of God and by God, for the purposes of God and for your benefit. And I've talked myself into a corner. I'm having trouble remembering what my point was. Maybe it was pointless, but we ought to trust that God knows what's going on in our lives. We ought to be prayerful to God and know that he's heard our prayers. Pray until we as we call it, pray through and know that God, through touching our heart, has heard the prayer and will act appropriately for our good. And then act rightly in this world, and don't go about lying to preserve a life over which you really don't have control in terms of when you're going to die. Well, he sinned again. Same sin. What do we take from that? Well, we don't read that Abraham was ever punished for that sin. That repeated sin. God never punished it for it. Abimelech didn't punish. Abimelech rewarded him as though he had done a good thing, just like Pharaoh had done in the earlier occasion. He was made richer by this sin, at least physically so. Does that mean that God does not punish sin? No. This sin and the former sin of the same type, back in Egypt with Pharaoh and Sarah, and that whole thing repeated exactly twice, was punished approximately 1900 years after the sin was committed according to the chronology of this world. It was punished when the payment was made by Abraham's great descendant, his seed, according to this promise, whereby all the world would be blessed. The greatest blessing that comes from Christ is the forgiveness of sins. It is through the forgiveness of sins that eternal life comes, because there is no life in a state of sin. But with sins forgiven, remitted, and removed from us by God, we can live before God. Not only here, but in the world to come. So Abraham's sins were laid upon his descendant, Jesus Christ, 1900 years after the sin, when Jesus paid that dreadful price for even those two sins on a cross. And the sins that I have made of similar natures, not the same thing, but immorality, misbehaviors, sins, transgressions of all sorts, are forgiven me. Not truly at the time I did them, but 2,000 years in the past, when, knowing my sins, Jesus took the sins unto his own person, in his own body, on the tree, and willingly paid the price in blood for my sins. And yours also, if you're saved. And if you're lost, they can be laid upon him should you seek after God's forgiveness with all your heart and find it, which you surely will if you diligently search, in prayer and humility and in conviction of heart, hating the sin that dwells in you, and seeking for the removal and forgiveness of sin. We can have that, just as Abraham did. So even the people of God sin, and they do repeated sins, and yet all sin is forgiven unto men. All manner of sin and blasphemy, according to Christ, is forgiven unto men. But it's forgiven based on Christ having paid the price. God does not overlook sin. But I'm not getting very far with this. I need to proceed. What's another lesson that we have? That Abimelech, notice how Abimelech, when he speaks to, when he speaks to God about it, God comes to him in a dream. And he says, "You're a dead man, Abimelech." Well, let's think about that for a minute. Why does God say, "I'm going to kill you"? That's what it means. You're a dead man. And everything that's yours is dead. meaning your nation. And Abimelech understood that. We'll read through his conversation that he said, are you going to destroy, bring vengeance upon me and my whole kingdom? Because of someone else is lying to me, and that I didn't know he was lying to me? He'd probably heard about Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain being destroyed just recently. He knew that God had destroyed them. He says, are you going to destroy this nation also because of a sin that I knew nothing about, that I was deceived into? In the integrity of my heart, I had no evil. Well, he says, in the integrity of my heart, meaning he knew nothing about the deception, and the innocency of my hands, he says, and have I done this? Well, God addresses the integrity of heart. He says, I knew that in your heart you didn't know about it. Your integrity is intact. You did not know you were about to commit adultery. Well, as to whether or not I was innocent in it, there's no one innocent. And God does not say, I know that you're innocent. There's only one innocent one, and that's the one that died on the cross for us. We're all guilty. We read in the book of Romans that the whole world is guilty before God. There's no innocency, but yet there is culpability by having known what you're due and then do it anyway. That's being culpable for it. And there's also a condition in which you do something ignorantly. You sin ignorantly, not knowing that what you're doing is, in fact, in this case, adultery. God knew all that. He said, I knew it. And the reason you didn't commit adultery with her, even though she was in your house, is because I stopped you from it. I mean, through providence, I guess. He had some other woman those nights, or whatever means that God used to prevent. Maybe he was sick, or we don't know why he didn't take Sarah to bed, but God prevented it. He said, because I knew that you didn't know about the deception of Abraham and Sarah here. However, if you don't give back the man his wife, if you do take her to your bed, you're going to die. And I'm going to destroy this nation. I'm going to destroy everybody involved in this. That's some scary stuff, because we take adultery as an everyday thing in this country. There's no punishment for it in this country. There's all kinds. You can murder infants and get away with it. You can commit sodomy and get away. There is, under the civil law of this nation anymore, there is no punishment for sins that in the past God destroyed nations for. Does that mean that there's no punishment for these sins today? Well, I would say there's no punishment in this country for those sins by this country. But God knows, and God doesn't change. If he would destroy a man for committing adultery back then, he'd kill him. One day, we'll pay a price. If we die in that sin, if we die having committed that and never having obtained forgiveness from it, the payment for that sin and all sins is death and eternal punishment by God. People don't want to believe that we're going to be eternally punished for sins that we somehow think are nothing. Somehow the world is so drastically changed. Here, this was 4,000 years ago, and Abimelech had enough sense to know that adultery was a sin punishable by death. So much so that he would not have taken Sarah to his bed, to his house, had he known that she was another man's wife. So just let's take that to heart and understand the so-called civilizations in which we presently live. And are they not ripe for a first-class destruction by God. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And understand this too. Why was his nation involved in it? Abimelech was the one that took Sarah to his house. But he said, I'm going to destroy you and everybody, everything you got. And Abimelech understood that to mean his people, because he says, are you going to destroy? I'll read it. He says, let me see if I can find it really quick. Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? I don't know that the Canaanites were particularly righteous, or particularly this set of the Philistines. This was a Philistine king. But the measure of their wickedness was not full, is what God had told Abraham. He said, it's going to be 400 years before I give this land fully to your descendants, because the wickedness, or the sin of the Canaanites, the inhabitants there, is not full. God is long suffering. He lets a lot of things go by for a long time in nations, but when there's a full measure of it, he acts. But that time was not yet. There were still people there that had a regard for the laws of God. Laws not yet written, but yet written in the conscience of men, and no doubt passed down from Noah, which wasn't but maybe 600 years before this, when the flood had come. And he's like, people knew they ought to behave. But he said, are you going to destroy a righteous nation? One that, in other words, one not guilty of having thus offended thee by this adultery that I didn't do, but I could have, but I didn't know. What does that mean to us? Well, I live in a nation to where the rulers of our nation has had us involved in one war or the other almost incessantly from our origin. Even before we were a nation, we were involved in war after war after war as colonies. And since then, very little peace. We wage wars of aggression, wars of conquest, and call it national defense. We used to have a Department of War. Now it's called a Department of Defense. It's not defense. It's bloody war. But we do it. And we like to say, those of us who are against that, those of us who are against adultery, those who are against sodomy, those that are against abortion, those that are against all the wickedness that's going on here, we like to say, well, we have nothing to do with that. We have no control over that. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't. We may try and yet fail. We may vote for people who say they're against those things, but yet aren't. In the integrity of our heart, we vote for someone who says he's against murdering infants in the womb, or he's against sodomy, or he's against whatever, and yet they turn around once they're elected and do the very same thing, or don't stop that bad thing from happening like they say they would. And we say, well, what's that to us? We're not the ruler. I'm not the president. I'm not the king. I'm not the emperor. I'm not the one that was going to do this thing or profit by it or enjoy it or anything like that. What did I have to do with that? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that God holds nations accountable and everyone in them for bad behavior. According to this text and according to history, it is important to us that our nations behave before God. And that probably truly does start with us. Because even though Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain were desperately caught up in the abomination, which is homosexuality and the things that pertain to that, the filthiness of it, yet Lot, who in foolishness was dwelling there, was not a partaker of their evil deeds, and he was spared from it. But the nation wasn't spared. The nation is not spared. The United States is guilty of things. And unless the nation repents and becomes a more righteous nation that can be exalted of God, then it's a reproach. And God will destroy it. We are involved in the judgments of the nations of God, the judgments of God against the nations in which we reside. God help us. Notice that when God had these interviews with Abimelech, God's appearing in dreams, but they're such dreams of a certain quality where there's no question. Abimelech totally knew that God had talked to him. He knew what to do, and he acted immediately. He gets up, and he gets all of his servants, and he calls them all together. He says, this is what's happened. And they were all terrified because they also were afraid of God's punishment upon them because their king was about to have committed adultery unknowingly. He would have knowingly taken her, which there may have been sin involved in that had she not given her consent, had he not married her. But adultery is a different thing, and it's punished differently, and it brings greater sin upon whoever's involved in it than other moral issues, some other. And they knew what had just happened to the cities of the plain, and they were terrified. And so Abimelech approaches Abraham and he says, what did you see here that made you, in what way, what did we do that make you think that we were a threat to you? Why would you treat me this way and lie to me like this about your wife, whom you said was your sister? Why would you do this? What did we ever do to you that you would treat us with such contempt? Now, he didn't say it ugly like that. He was very courteous. God had told him that Abraham was a prophet, which is interesting. This really never occurred to me before. I've never read any prophecy of Abraham. It may be in the book, and it may not be. But here we learn that he was a prophet. We know he was a friend of God. We know he was of the household of God once he was, born again, just like all people enter into that household, spiritually by birth from above, divine, if you will, in so much that the seed of God is the genesis of that life in the reborn soul. But we knew that he was a great man. He's going to be the father of many nations. Through him all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. All saved people are going to be saved through the seed of Abraham, meaning Christ. But we didn't read he was a prophet. Except here, he's a prophet. It doesn't surprise me that he was one, because he was a righteous man. He had lots of people. People liked him. He probably told them about God. Prophecy is not just telling future events. It's also a term that can be applied to those who are forthtelling existing truths concerning God. It can be, in a sense, preaching. There's a difference between prophecy of future events and preaching, but they can both come under the general heading of prophet. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, but I have been called to preach, and I try to do it. Abraham, if he was called to preach, even if not, he, as a witness of the salvation of God, he doubtless told people about his own forgiveness of sin, about how God forgave them time after time, forgave them of idol worship in Ur of the Chaldees, forgave them of being slow getting to the land of promise, and tarrying in Haran with his father until he died, and going and acting like Sarah was his brother as opposed to his wife. And he no doubt told the many mercies of God to people, to all the people that came to his house. Strangers would come up, and he'd act as though they were his masters, and sometimes they were. He was entertaining angels unaware, but he was a gracious host. And he laid out spreads for people to eat, and he conversed with them. And I guarantee you that the thing that's always on Abraham's heart was the Lord God and his mercies. He told people about the Lord. And he had very loyal slaves and servants and friends that worked with and for him, most likely because of these prophecies, so-called. But he said he's a prophet. God told Abimelech that Abraham's a prophet. Give him back his wife, or you're going to die and everything you got. Abimelech reproves Abraham more mildly than I think I would have, but Abraham's a better man than me by far. He does extemporize here. He says, well, she was, truly she is. He says, yet indeed she is my sister. You know, it was a very lame, I'm just going to use a common word today. It was a lame thing to say. And it was treated appropriately by Abimelech. Abimelech does not regard that at all. Abraham's like, well, I know you think I'm a liar, but really she is my sister. Well, Abimelech was about to be put to death by God and his whole nation. I don't think he thought it was funny or cute that she just happened to be Abraham's half-sister. Abimelech knew that the reason he said she's my sister was so that Abimelech would not know that she was indeed Abraham's wife. You know, just as our sins don't deceive God, they don't always deceive men. Usually the truth will out. And I think of all the things I've read of Abraham, this is the one this little verse 12, it's the one that disappoints me the most. Not that I'm his judge. He's not my servant. He's God's. I'm not judging him, but I am looking at this as a human, and Abraham was a human. I'm looking at it also as a child of God, and Abraham was a child of God. I've done things as bad or worse, without a doubt. But I would expect it of myself. I guess I thought better things of Father Abraham. But I'd be wrong. If we put too much faith in any man, the best of men are men at best. There's none righteous. No, not one. Jesus speaking to his apostles, he says, if ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children. He says the apostles are evil. Well, where do I stand? Where do you stand? We're all evil before God. And we have no standing based upon our performance in terms of works under the law. Therefore, by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified, because we're all condemned, because we've all sinned and fallen short. And I knew all that, but yet as I read verse 12, well, indeed she is my sister. She's the daughter of my father, but she's not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And so, it just got to happen. She's my sister, and well, she became my wife. And and Abimelech doesn't say one word about it. Not one word. He almost blames God here in verse 13. Abraham does. And it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house. So God made me leave Ur of the Chaldees. Well, he told him to, and he did. He believed God. It was counted him for righteousness to wander from my father's house. Then I said unto her, Sarah, this is thy kindness which thou shalt show me. In every place where we go, say of me, he's my brother. Did Abimelech say, oh, now I see Abraham. Yeah, I understand fully. I would have done the same thing. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say anything. Well, not yet, he does. First off, he takes sheep, he takes oxen, he takes men's slaves, and the word means slave, not servants, slave men and slave women, and he gives them to Abraham. He gives Sarah back to him as his wife, and he says, behold. I mean, see, doesn't Abimelech stand tall here compared to Abraham? Let he that standeth take heed lest he fall. Those of us who have been saved and we think that we walk in our integrity and that we're good people on this earth, we need to understand that there's heathen out there that are lost, who have better moral behavior than we do at times. Abimelech says, behold, my land is before thee. Dwell where it pleaseth. Just anywhere you want to live, Abraham. Take these oxen and sheep and these slaves and go live where you want to live. No restrictions. Why? Because God told him Abraham was a prophet. And Abimelech, king of some of the Philistines, was afraid of God. He may have despised Abraham. He made no comment about Abraham's little dance there about, well, she really was my sister. Because it's contemptuous. It was beneath Abimelech to even discuss it with Abraham. That's why it's offensive to me to some degree. And I'm one of the last people that will find fault where it's not written specifically there at fault. But still, I don't even want to find fault against the people in the Bible that are God's people, because they're all better than me. And Abraham's included, but this was really beneath Abraham to have said what he said. He should have said nothing. Or he should have said, you're right. You gave me no cause to treat you this way. Please forgive me for assuming that you were bad, that you were perhaps as bad as I would be in your place. I don't know what he was thinking, but he should have apologized instead of extemporizing or making something up. Abimelech shows himself very gracious, and for good reason. It's an odd thing that God has Abraham pray for him when it was Abraham that was at fault. But Abraham, being a prophet and being a friend of God and being in a position to intercede with God, he intercedes on behalf of the person who he himself, Abraham, had treated badly and nearly caused his death and the death of his nation. Abraham was to blame, but Abraham also makes the prayer of intercession. Abraham was an intercessor, and as such is a type or a picture of Christ, who is the great interceder, the great advocate that we have with the Father. But in this, he diverged from that typical figure, because Jesus did nothing wrong. And Jesus was guilty of nothing. There's no way that he's to blame for anything, and yet he, in his true innocency, intercedes for every person that comes to him, comes to God through him. And so, and he also speaks to Sarah. And I've got just a couple of minutes. Abimelech says to Sarah, behold, I've given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Doesn't sound like a small amount. Behold, he is to thee a covering for the eyes, and all that are with thee, with all other. Thus she, Sarah, was reproved. So he's saying, Sarah, you're not to blame in this. You went along with this story that you cooked up with your husband, this device that you had, and you went ahead with it, and you deceived me. You acted like you were his sister and not his wife. He says, he's got 1,000 pieces of silver from me. So, you need to keep your eyes on him alone, and don't let yourself become the object of the eyes of the men of this world. It's an odd thing, because she was 90. We would think that no one would desire her, but apparently she was extremely beautiful, even at 90. So much so that a king would take her to house and to bed when she's 90 years old. I think he's saying, cover up. Don't put yourself on display. Don't tempt men with your beauty. Your eyes should be to your husband. and you should not be inviting the eyes of other men. And I think that goes true for a lot of women today. They act as though some terrible thing is done when some man notices them, and yet they dress in such a way that men will notice them. I guess I'm a sexist for saying it, but I believe it's true. And I think most people who give it any sober thought will know that that happens a lot in today's world. So Abraham prays to God, and God healed Abimelech, and we now learn that his wife and all of his maidservants and all those that would have been bearing children during this interval bore none, because God had closed up their wombs. And it says God healed Abimelech. And we don't know what sickness he had, but he was healed of it. And because Abraham prayed, God heard. Everybody did what God said to fix this situation. It was fixed, except the sin of it. The sin of it was carried forward 1900 years to the cross, where Christ, the great-grandson of Abraham, paid a price in blood for his ancestors' sin and for mine too. And God bless you. We'll see you next time.